Several years ago, I was at a big wood turner symposium, and I was hanging out in a booth demonstrating some tool sharpening for a sponsor. And across the aisle from me stood a man in a simple booth that was mostly populated with two large objects. One was this big, beautiful lathe, which seemed to catch the eye of every pro turner in the place, and they were all drifting over throughout the day to check it out. But from my vantage point on the other side of the aisle, I noticed something curious going on. As folks waited their turn to try out the lathe, one by one they turned their attention to the other large object. It was a 5-foot-long steel box with what looked like two jet engines mounted on the top. It wasn't as shiny and flashy as the lathe with its black and gold color scheme and its bright chrome accents. It really wasn't the type of thing that most wood turners come to shows like that to see. But by the end, everyone was talking about this thing. It stole the show. That was my introduction to the Harvey Gyro Air Dust Extractor. It was like nothing I had ever seen in all my years of woodworking. I knew I had to have one. So in early 2020, I finally took delivery of the G700, which is the smallest of their 3 gyro models. I installed it in one of my shops. I did a brief introductory review at that time on an episode of Cool Tools where I gave my first impressions. And that was pretty much all I said publicly about it, although I did answer lots and lots of questions privately. I never really talked much about it on the channel because that's not how internet reviews work, right? People give their first impressions, but they rarely update their opinions after a long time has passed and they've had a lot more experience with the tool. Well, I've had this thing in my shop for nearly 4 years now. It's recently been moved to a new location, that's why there isn't anything hooked to the inlet, but this has been in service for about 3.5 years. In that time, it's been used in all sorts of projects here. I know this thing well. I know its quality, its performance. I know the things about it that I like, and the things that maybe I would do differently if I was designing it. Perhaps most importantly, it's been used side by side with a big traditional cyclone system because there was already one of those in the shop here at that time. That cyclone has stayed at that end of the shop powering those machines, and the G700 has been on this side of the shop powering these machines. So that has given me a long-term direct side-by-side comparison of these two types of big dust collectors that few people have had the chance to experience. So today, I'm going to distill all this experience into a concise rundown of the pros and cons of the Gyro Dust Extractor that will help you decide if they are just a gimmick or if they live up to all the hype. What hype am I talking about? Well, the most common things that people, including myself, have said about the G700 is that it's quieter than comparably powerful systems, it uses less power, it's easier to maintain, it can be easily moved around the shop, and it's uniquely shaped to better use your available space. Those were my initial impressions. Now, after years of use, let me give you the good and the bad. Let's start with the noise. A typical dust collector that's capable of this kind of suction runs as loud as 90 to 100 decibels, give or take. The G700 is much quieter, but you have to understand that unlike other systems, this has a variable speed motor. So if I'm using a machine that's only a few feet away from the inlet, or which doesn't need tons of suction, I might run it on low. That'll conserve energy, but it will also keep the noise at just over 60 decibels. That's amazingly quiet for a large dust collector. For example, we have to yell in here if the big cyclone is running, but I can easily be heard over the G700. If I do crank it all the way up, which, let's face it, that's how I normally run it because I love all the power, it still only maxes out a little over 70 decibels. Now to put that in perspective, if you have a shop in a garage that's attached to your house, the people inside the house probably won't notice it's on, and your neighbors will have no idea. Now speaking of saving energy, the G700 only draws about 6 amps, I believe. Think about what that means in a small shop. Let's say you only have one 240 volt circuit. I personally would have no problem running this dust collector along with a big table saw or any other machine on the same circuit. That's a big deal in a lot of shops. Now, the reason why it runs on so much less power is because it utilizes a different type of technology. That's what those jet engine looking things are all about. It's hard to explain, so I'm just going to link to their website below for those who want to have their minds blown, because this represents a huge innovation in dust collection. And it's why you can get such efficient airflow and such consistently high static pressure from a 2 horsepower system. That's right, I said 2 horsepowers, but don't let that fool you. Don't make the mistake of comparing it to traditional 2 horsepower dust collectors with the old technology. This performs like a much bigger system. It's rated, I think, maybe a little conservatively at 1,100 cubic feet per minute. But in actual practice, it seems similar to my original 5 horsepower Clearview Cyclone. I'm not saying Clearview's 1,900 cubic feet per minute rating was an exaggeration, but the G700 just seems to me to collect just as much dust at my machines. Now, there are other factors, maybe the ductwork configuration, because it was in 2 different shops. Maybe it's also the limitation of 4-inch ports on most machines, which is kind of a bottleneck anyway. But I see little actual difference in performance at the end of the day, despite this being rated at 2 horsepower, when other machines perform less at much higher horsepower ratings. Now, what about day-to-day maintenance? This is where I do have a couple of complaints. The biggest pain in the butt when it comes to dust collection is emptying out the chips. When the bin sensor on my big Cyclone goes off here in the shop, everybody just hides, they disappear. Nobody wants to empty that giant barrel. It's heavy, it's messy, it's dusty. The G700 attempts to solve that problem in a really unique way. It has a double bin setup. One bin holds large chips, and that's going to fill the fastest, while the other holds fine dust, and it requires less frequent dumping. I love how it rolls out smoothly, how easy it is to just pull the bags out, which you can then dump and reuse many, many times over. It's definitely cleaner and easier to manage than my big barrel system. But the combined capacity is 32 gallons, and since the chip side is not even the full 32, that's what you're going to be emptying the most. That's the trade-off. You're going to be dumping this more often. How often? Well, if you're milling a big pile of rough boards with your jointer and your planer, you might have to stop a couple of times to empty at least the large chip side of the bin. Granted, it's much easier to empty, but it's also most often. However, if you're just using your table saw, your bandsaw, your chop saw, and similar tools, then you're going to go much longer before the built-in bin sensor alarm goes off and says, time to empty me. You might even go months between emptying if you have a hobby-level shop. But it is something to consider if you have a big, busy operation. In that case, you might want to consider one of the bigger models with the larger bins. The filters are another consideration. The G700 uses a pair of HEPA filters, and they aren't huge, so you do need to clean them a bit more often. Harvey does simplify the process in a creative way. Each filter has an outlet at the end of the machine. So if you stick your dust collection hose right on there and you turn the machine on, it sort of cleans itself. You help it out by turning knobs on the top to spin internal agitators, which knock the cake dust out of the filter pleats. It works well, but I personally just wonder if those agitators may add wear and tear to the filters. I haven't had to replace one yet, and it has been several years, but they aren't cheap. So when I'm cleaning it, I don't get any more aggressive with those agitators than I need to just clean out the filters. That brings me to mobility. And the G700's obviously a unique shape, which catches a lot of people's attention. Most people love this, but there are some complaints floating around, so let me explain. This is a 450-pound unit. It's 57 inches end to end, 24 inches front to back, and 34 inches top to bottom. It looks like a big stationary system that you just stick in a corner, connect permanent ductwork to it, and never move it, like a traditional Cyclone, right? Well, you definitely can do that, but it is designed to be mobile as well. You can wheel this around your shop, taking it directly to a machine or from one area to another if you're so inclined. It rolls smoothly on a flat floor, but it has to be moved like a cart. What I mean is only the wheels at the right end, down by the filter cleanouts, only those swivel. The wheels on the other end are fixed straight. So this requires a bit more space to move it around like you're pulling a trailer to make your turns and so on. This is nothing new for mobile vases, which have 2 swivel wheels and 2 fixed wheels, but it is something to consider if you have a really tight shop. Notice how I built a bench around mine. This is a great benefit of this collector. It can be tucked under a work surface to better utilize space in your tight shop. But sliding it backwards to get it between those legs and underneath that bench was difficult due to that wheel configuration. Now, of course, the solution would be to just add an extra foot to the length of my bench so there's space beneath it to turn it and pull it out rather than having to slide it directly forward and back. That would also give me better access to my filter cleanouts on the end. I wish I had thought of that when I built my bench. How does its unique footprint compare to other dust collectors though? Well, the Cyclone I have on the other side of my shop and the one I had in my old shop had a footprint, when you consider the filter stack next to it, of about 2 feet by 4 feet. And it needs more than 8 feet of ceiling height. The G700 footprint is about 2 feet by 5 feet. But it requires less than 3 feet of clearance, which again makes it ideal for shops with low ceilings. You can tuck it beneath benches, shelving, lumber racks, however else you want to use that extra space. There are 2 more things though that I've learned about the system which you really need to consider. First, notice how the inlet comes out down by the floor on the front of the unit. Now this is similar to what you find on a lot of single stage dust collectors, so it's nothing new. Works well, especially when you run your ductwork on the floor, perhaps along a wall behind a row of machines, or if you run a hose directly across the shop from the inlet to one machine at a time. But if you plan to run your ductwork all on the ceiling and then drop down to various machines from above, then you're going to need some extra room for the duct to gradually climb up the wall. You don't want to put just a tight 90-degree bend right out of the front of the dust collector. You'll kill your airflow. So in that case, I would put a 45-degree Y on the inlet. Then I would run one branch along the floor, servicing machines along that wall, while the other branch angles up the wall till it gets to the ceiling, and then you can go across the shop and drop down wherever you like. It's not a big deal, but you have to think it through. The last point worth mentioning is the remote control. I love that the G700 comes with extra features like the dust bin alarm that's built in and the integrated remote on-off system that other machines just don't come with. But it did take some getting used to because the nature of that gyroscopic separation technology requires several seconds after you push the button for the system to get up to speed. Now at first it kind of seemed like forever and it kind of threw off my rhythm. If you are used to walking up to your table saw and just hitting 2 switches, one for the saw, one for the dust collector, and making your cut, you might find it a little tedious at first. But after a while, I just changed my process. I have the remote in my apron, so I hit the switch before I walk over to the saw. By the time I pick up my board, get to the saw, turn that on, everything's ready to go. So it doesn't slow me down, it just caused me to adapt, and now it's second nature. So after more than 3 years of experience with the Harvey Gyro Air G700, let me summarize my pros and cons. The pros are it's quieter, it uses less power while performing as well or better than a system with a larger motor. The bins are easier to dump, the filters are easier to clean, and if you get creative, it can take up less space in a small shop. The cons are the heavy milling that you might do could fill your bins quickly. I wish it had 4 swivel wheels on the bottom. The slower startup did require a minor change to my workflow, and the low inlet requires a different duct configuration than my Cyclone did, which is really the only reason why I haven't taken the Cyclone out of the shop and switched to this entirely. I just don't want to change all the ductwork we have up on the ceiling. But I will say that when I do eventually take out this ductwork because I want to upgrade to some steel ductwork, I'm going to be switching entirely to Harvey for my dust extraction. I might even try out their G800 system, which looks even better. Now here's something else to consider. For the last several years, I've been replacing my cheap drill and Forstner bits with quality bits from Fish Tools. They're a family-run company that still forges their bits the old-fashioned way. Try replacing your most used bits with Fish bits using the links in the notes below this video, and you'll see why I love them so much.